Hi, Malcolm. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, it's great. It's great to be here.
Uh, so I'm really hoping to hear more from you about the non-naive trust dance, which you've been talking about, whispering about here and there, and curious to hear more about that and what that is, and just kind of have you explain it for us and hear how you arrived at those ideas. But would love to just start by circling back to a couple of things that are specific to our relationship and kind of some context for this conversation.
Cool. Yeah.
So the first thing is so you and I have had the good fortune of being together in physical space, I think three or four different times, three times, I think. And I think from the very first conversation, you asked to record that conversation. And that's happened most of the times that I've been with you. And I know that this is a thing that you do. And I would love to hear from you why you started recording conversations. Because I think, one, it's really interesting as a practice in itself, but it's also kind of like, in a weird way, the like lineage of this podcast is like, oh, if I'm going to have interesting conversations with
Hmm.
people, I should record them anyway. So I would love to hear from you about that and why you started doing it and what it's been like and all of that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's yeah. I can see why that question's a good starting point. Um. So, and I'm a little bit amused at like I'm amused at it as a starting point as well because there's quite a number of recordings that I have with people, particularly in the very first conversation in which we were recording or perhaps even meeting. There's a lot of conversations that I have with people where the uh the first part of the conversation is about how we're recording conversations. So it's
Totally.
like um they're like sure, and then they're like what's the deal with that anyway, and I'm like well so um yeah, so this practice emerged in the culture incubator that I spent the better part of the last decade living at in Waterloo, which has been known by various names. Uh, Upstart Collaboratory for Collaborative Culture Design being kind of one of the longest running names, and more recently the Liminal Space Agency. And we started doing this in 2016. Well, prior to that, we'd been recording our meetings. Like we would have a kind of weekly meeting that was this group practicing and talking about this new culture. But as we started to take things more seriously, particularly those of us who are living there, we began recording pretty much all of our conversations, and the all of themness came from how often we'd get halfway through a conversation, realize something really juicy was happening, and be like, "Oh, are we recording this?" And so eventually, we just started having a really strong default to just recording everything. Um, the mere act of recording a conversation changes it. Even if you don't end up doing anything with the recordings, it gives a different feel to the a few different dimensions of what's present. Like there's the sense of awareness that other people might hear what you're saying who don't have the context that the people that you're like that are live in the conversation have, and so that can create some different kinds of like contextual awareness. um, but in terms of the main reason why we started, it was that we were noticing that in terms of the group coherence that we were looking for, it made a huge difference to be able to uh, basically fully like give people a full experience of conversations they weren't in. And there's kind of a few reasons why that um why that was powerful. So one of them is um just if something important happened, somebody had a major insight or a learning or some sort of cool exchange happened, we could share that in full fidelity with people. um there was also like the experience of like re-listening to yourself, like, and being able to notice like, oh yeah, that was the point in the conversation when I suddenly got really angry. Like what was going on for me there, and like why did you could basically use them therapeutically. And in the coherence therapy work I've done the last year with a therapist, we've used a kind of just memory based technique called rewind, where you just like you go into the situation where you had some trigger come up or whatever, and you just try to rewind the tape until right before the trigger, and you kind of, you know. And so I've had experiences in of listening already. It's occurring to me. I've had experiences of listening to recordings and literally re-listening to a particular minute like multiple times to be like, what was going on there for me, and like, what do I think was going on there for this other person? Like, so that's really cool. And then another big piece is basically, I'm going to say something really obvious, which is you don't know what it's like when you're not there. Like, you don't know what a conversation's like when you're not in it. And this is more obviously true for somebody as loud and boisterous as I am. But even in general, like, you don't know what how people talk when you're not in the room, you know. I've never been in a conversation of all women. I can't be. It wouldn't be a conversation of all women if I were. Um, but to have the experience of being able to witness those conversations, not just among, you know, actors on TV, but among the very people that you're usually in conversation with, can be very powerful. You can notice the moments when, um, I mean, for instance, it's very, very obvious when I'm listening to a recording and there's a moment when, like, if I were sitting there, like, I almost certainly would have like jumped in with some comment, but I'm not there, so I didn't. And then like I get to find out what happens when I don't. Um, so oh, and I guess, yeah, so those are a bunch of reasons. And I guess the fourth reason I would point at is it can be a cool way for people to meet each other. This has sometimes been fraught, and I mean, we can talk more about some of the tensions that have arisen around recordings and so on, as well. Um, but when it's been good, it's been really cool. Like, one of the people who's involved with the project now, I met him 3 years ago. Um, right around at the time I met you, I guess, actually. Like, yeah, because we first hung out in the Bay Area when I was there. And so we recorded, you know, a chunk of our conversation where he had heard about the group I was part of and was asking about it. And I said, you know, let's record, and we recorded it and sent it back, you know, to the um group, and they kind of, you know, transcribed it and reflected on it. And it was the conversation was in part about how he was interested in joining the thing. And that was such a powerful introduction. Like, I didn't have to say, hey guys, there's this guy who, and like try to tell them about him and try to explain why I thought he resonated with our, you know, views and stuff like that, and possibility spaces. I could just give a live demo of like, yeah, here's us talking, and, you know, going into, you know, these different angles. So that was really cool. And he's, I mean, he's part of that project now. Like, he joined it over the course of the following year. And yeah.
So I had two questions for you when I first heard about this practice of recording things, which was, I guess it was coming from a place of like, this practice seems really cool, recording everything, but what does it actually take practically to do that? And one of the questions was sort of, how many of these conversations do you find yourself going back to, listening to again, transcribing, doing other things with, sharing with people, whatever it is that you might do with them? What sort of percentage did you find yourself going back to?
Yeah. It's hard to say in terms of a percentage, because you know, I don't have that good of a sense of the total number of hours of recording that we would generate. And we were definitely recording more when I was in Waterloo. Well, in part because there were just more people, and so you could literally have a span of, you know, 3 hours where, you know, 5 hours of recordings were made, right? Because you'd have this group and that group both talking and separately recording, and then sometimes, you know, they'd share with each other and so forth. um and when we were there, we made a decent number of transcripts, and Otter helped in terms of doing like automatic transcripts. um but And then with, at the moment here with Sarah, who you know, my partner, and with Eric, who was just recently on your podcast as well. we've been doing, we still record a substantial number of our conversations, but not kind of as many as were recorded in Waterloo. And we also do less re-listening to them here. I mean, I think that's partially, there's a few reasons for that. One of them is that, you know, we've been working with just like a lot more logistical stuff in terms of what our day-to-day attention has been on. You know, like we're currently moving, and so like we're having a bunch of conversations about furniture and stuff. And you know, interesting cultural tidbits can come up in that, but it's less it's way lower density, and so it's usually not worth listening to those. But you know, like Sarah and I had a conversation a couple months ago about some of her vision for the future, and I was like, "Oh, Eric, like you've definitely got to hear this. You know, this is important for cohering our sense of a vision of what we're doing." Oh, but then the other thing is like just because there's only three of us, it's somewhat less likely to get out of sync or get out of coherence without having enough, you know, that many recordings. So that's part of it. But I mean, it is really interesting to consider the cases where things are transcribed. I realize I'm not answering your sort of percentage question very well. I would say probably Liminal Space Agency would make transcripts per week, in terms of like transcripts that they actively do any editing to, not just like throwing it into Otter, on the order of like 1 to 5 hours of conversation time worth of transcript per week, which is a fair bit. I mean, in terms of how long it takes to edit them. And then these would kind of, you know, get referenced and used for various things and commented on and stuff like that. And I mean, it can also, I didn't mention this when you're asking like what's the value of recording, but it can also just help to deepen your sense of what's happening, to like revisit like, oh yeah, this is this really important meeting we had a couple days ago. Like it's very easy to lose touch with some breakthrough that you have, and without the recordings you can almost feel a little bit crazy, like did that even happen, like were we really on the same page like a week ago? I thought we were on the same page about something, but like if all you have is a bunch of people's different memories. I mean, that's the other thing that can be really cool, like unpacking misunderstandings. Like you know, we once had a thing where I said something and then somebody else reflected back what they thought they heard me say, and it was the exact opposite, and we were like, wait, no, I definitely said blanc. And they're like, I definitely heard blanc. And it's like, that's one of those things where you really kind of have to agree to disagree if you don't have a recording. There's kind of like a, well, here's what I remember meaning to say, and the other person's like, well, here's the meaning I definitely got. And like that's kind of, you're left with a deeply unknown objective truth about like what was said in fact. But in one case in particular, we revisited it and we found that what had happened was I had started a sentence and it had a negation in it. It's like, yeah, I'm sure that I'm not gonna blah 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 blah. And what I had done was I had tried to sort of cut and edit my sentence midway, but I hadn't properly indicated that what followed was supposed to not be negated by the not or something. And so it made total sense in retrospect that I had thought that I had clearly said one thing and somebody else had thought that I'd clearly said the opposite. Like when we re-listened to it, it was like, it was such a powerful experience of this sort of interpersonal parallax of like seeing like, wow, your perspective makes sense and my perspective makes sense. Like they both made a lot of sense, you know, and we could revisit the data in order to see that.
When I first talked to you about it, and also now, I got sort of a sense of like a principle that if you record your conversations, that you can't know in advance which conversations are going to be important, but if you record it, you're just going to have it recorded, and it might be extremely useful in the future to have it recorded. Does that seem fair to describe your experience of that?
Totally, yeah. And so it's to be expected that a large fraction of them don't end up getting used. That's kind of necessary in order to get a large fraction of the ones that do need to be used because you can't know in advance. I mean, you can sometimes know in advance, like that a conversation is more or less likely. And there's obviously conversations where it's sort of like, it's going to be historical, right? Like in some way, like, these people meeting for the first time or whatever.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, one important caveat, because people have been confused about this before, is that the culture there is not like Bridgewater's. So Bridgewater is, I guess, a hedge fund or something like that, some investment company that has itself a really interesting and weird culture, which was profiled in Robert Keegan's An Everyone Culture book. And they record all of their meetings. I don't think they record hallway conversations, which is itself interesting. Right, like, but they record all of their meetings, and those recordings are, I guess, either automatically or maybe they even have people hired to like transcribe them or whatever, and anyone who was mentioned in the meeting gets notified about that. So it's sort of, in principle, there's no secrets. I think that is risky, like, in a certain sense. I mean, maybe fine in a sufficiently corporate context, maybe, but or by corporate, I don't actually mean corporate. Maybe fine in a sufficiently technical context. Um, but no secrets, because if you don't actually have the psychological safety needed to have no secrets, and you try to impose no secrets, what you instead get is secrets, right? Like, you get people like actually in fact having secrets, but like sort of implying that they don't exist on a deeper level than is ordinarily done with secrets. And that seems, I don't know, that seems stressful. And certainly when doing kind of the sort of collaborative culture research and development work that that Liminal Space Agency has been doing, and that I'm doing now with Eric and Sarah, it's like, in doing that work, you kind of need to be able to have conversations with some person without immediately sharing it with the other person, because it's like that's part of how you can just even make sense of what experience you're having, right? Like, other people might have like blind spots or frames that make it hard to speak to them about something that they're doing that's bothering you. I've noticed that sometimes people become kind of stupefied when they try to tell somebody about, like, if one person's holding a really strong frame and the other person tries to like give them feedback, they'll end up feeling dumb. And I mean dumb in both senses of the word, like unintelligent, but also mute. Like, it's just hard, because when you're trying to tell somebody something, you're implicitly modeling how are they going to receive it. And if somebody's got a blind spot about something, and you try to point at that something, then the act of modeling how they'll receive it makes you unable to think it. And so there's something really important about being able to think kind of outside of that context with somebody else. Like, what is this thing going on with this person and this thing they keep doing? And like, do you have that experience too? It's like, well, I see what you're pointing at, but I see it more like this. And you can kind of triangulate what's going on and get a sense of, oh, I'm seeing something real here, which you wouldn't get if you tried to talk with the person themselves about it, because they'd be doing some frame thing that would make it hard to notice that you had a thing to say. And that's everybody. Like, that's like, people do it to greater and lesser degrees, but like, this is true of everybody. That we all have blind spots. We all are hard to talk to about our blind spots. That's part of what makes them blind spots.
There's so much there that I could ask you about.
And I mean, and that starts to get into like non-naive trust dance type of stuff.
Totally. Maybe just to begin, I want to make sure that I understood something correctly. You were sort of contrasting the culture of Liminal Space Agency to Bridgewater, and you're saying Bridgewater, all the meetings, at least like the group meetings, are public by default, and people are notified if they were spoken about. But what were you saying about the contrasts, that the way the culture is at Liminal Space Agency?
Right. So I'm gonna riff on a tiny common error that you made in speaking about the Bridgewater thing,
Mm-hmm.
in order to lay out a small framework that I have around um, English is a very confused language with respect to one particular thing, which is that we have the word public and we have the word private, and we don't have a word for like neither.
Mm.
Right. And you referred to the Bridgewater recordings being public, which they obviously aren't. They are
Right.
shared within Bridgewater. They
Right.
are public.
Internally public or something like
Yeah,
that.
internally public or something. But even internally public doesn't cover something like some other um kind of tag of sharing concern. I'm trying. There's no word for it, right? But the thing that private is like you don't share it, and then public is like everybody has it. But what's the term for something that like you share with discretion when it makes sense to you, given all of the context and information that you have, including perhaps knowledge that somebody might want something relatively not shared with certain people, and they certainly wouldn't want it to become public, right? Like what there's no word for that, right? Which is problematic because sometimes people have assumptions that everything that's being said is in some sense private, and it's like, well, no, everything should definitely fall into the discretion bucket by default. Right? Because otherwise, and in fact, that's how people treat it on some level. Like you have to use your own discretion. You can't use anything else. What else would you use? Private is just a heuristic within which to strongly guide your own discretion. And and the importance of respecting it, and respecting it 100% is very high. And so, if something is explicitly stated as private, it's like, I'm going to strongly undermine somebody else's trust in me if I go and share that. But when things are kind of more nebulous, it's like we need to rely on our discretion. And at that point, the role of saying like, hey, I don't want this shared, is guiding somebody else's discretion, and trusting that since they do in fact have the power to share it, that they will want to respect what you've said about not wanting it shared. Like like calling it private doesn't magically force them to not share it anyway. And so there is necessarily a trust that's being relied on there. Anyway, this is all relevant to the actual question you were asking. So it's not just a kind of, I mean, I have a little rant about this and I like doing my rant, but it's not just about the sort of public private thing. It's about like, how are the recordings managed in this kind of a culture incubator or whatever. And in general, within the group, there was kind of a culture of basically, unless specifically tagged, the conversations were well, I guess, part of the question also is, how do you manage all of this? And mostly we've just had them in Google Drive, which is the least worst bad option or something. Like it's really not great. One of the things that's not great about it is that, to just put on my like designer hat for a moment, like the hierarchy of visibility in Google Drive is reversed, which is to say, like, if you're shared on a folder, then you can see anything in that subfolder, right? But when it comes to groups, what you want is ever more nested like subgroups where those outside can't see things, right? Like that's how group based privacy actually works. And it's the opposite of the Google Drive hierarchy, where like everything in a thing is visible to everybody who can see the top level thing. So there's had to be a bunch of folders that aren't associated with each other on Google Drive because they capture the different membranes of who can see which recordings. But anyway, so yeah, I would like to see a whole app that has like SoundCloud like commenting features, where you can just kind of comment on the point in the recording. But like at this point, that might as well be integrated with like transcript commenting features. and but Otter's not really made to organize the kind of volume of transcripts that we produce, or volume of recordings that we would produce. um it's it's just not like, it just doesn't have the organizational features at all for anything like that. um I'm also kind of like holding out for some sort of like Otter Roam integration where like you can specifically reference like in your Roam blocks like utterances from a conversation that got transcribed or something like that. That seems pretty cool. Um, but yeah, so basically, stuff would get uploaded to Google Drive, stuff that seemed important to um, keep private to a smaller group for whatever reason would sometimes not get shared, or would just get shared directly if somebody needed access to it. Then there'd be subgroups that would kind of have different folders to them, whether that was like a working team on some particular project, or whether that was uh, I mean, the group had a kind of tendency to, like, at any given time there would be a core of 2 to 4 people, and I think it's now up to the full 6 people that are living there, which is pretty cool. But a subgroup of 2 to 4 people that had enough kind of group coherence to really think together effectively and not get kind of constantly caught up on distrust or um, other kinds of jankinesses. And so often that group at any given time would kind of have its own folder that stuff was going in, where they could be talking about and making sense of what's going on with this person who's also kind of in the scene but not in this core group, who's having these whatever difficulties, and they would want the capacity to sort of do that sense making without immediately sharing it with the peer person that they're trying to make sense of. So um but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of complex stuff to navigate there in terms of like inclusion and exclusion dynamics and all sorts of stuff. But I would say in general, the recordings probably help with that, because even if you're not in a conversation, there's a chance that like later you can go and hear it and um, comment on it even. There's one last cool thing that I'll just say about the power of recordings, which is power that you also for the most part get with fish bowling, which is to say somebody like listening to a conversation but explicitly like not being a speaker, a participant in that conversation. um, which is that it's generally my experience that if you're in a conversation, so um like so I was talking with no, I can't quite, let me see, hang on. There's something uh where if you're in a conversation and somebody kind of says something that you see as being false or confused or um misleading or sort of um uh, uh people talk about like a dangerous thought, and I don't mostly mean in the kind of um, political sense, but even just like if somebody thinks, for instance, that combining ammonia and bleach is a good idea. Like I think that's one of the 2 household chemicals that like if you combine them, you get a chemical reaction and can die. Like that's a dangerous thought, right? Like a suggestion that someone could make. So if you're in a conversation, you're kind of if somebody says something and you don't kind of comment like, hey, no, that's a bad idea, or that's not true, or that's bullshit of some kind, there can be there's a way in which you're kind of implicitly agreeing with the thing, or you're at least kind of saying that it's sort of a reasonable or appropriate or sort of fine thing to sort of be unquestioned on the record, where on the record I don't even mean the recording, I just mean in the record of everybody who's there in the conversation. um, if you're fishbowling or you're listening to a recording, you didn't have the chance to interrupt, and so by not interrupting, which you didn't have the chance to do, you're not actually sort of signing off on anything. And so that can be really powerful as well if you're dealing with people with different models or frames, is to, yeah, when there's a recording or a live fish bowling, to have the chance for people to um, have their experience of dissonance and maybe write it in a journal or something like that, but the conversation gets to flow without that dissonance being immediately brought in. Um, and that can be cool. Like I've done a bunch of fish bowling, particularly like last summer and fall when I was differentiating myself more from the rest of the group. I did a bunch of fish bowling, and this is where I noticed this. I was like, oh, like, yeah, if they were having this conversation and I was in it, like if, you know, I would have to be interrupting here because I think that this is profoundly naive. But uh, because I'm not in the conversation, I don't have to, because I can't, in a certain sense, interrupt. And so I can just sit there and go, oh, well, how are they making sense of this? And it allowed space for more curiosity on my part. Um, yeah, because I wasn't sort of having to sign off on things I didn't agree with by implicitly being part of the conversation. There's other ways you can do that, of course. And even the word of course is related to that, which is if you're the way that things get languaged strongly affects what people feel they're signing off on by listening and sort of allowing a statement to stand. Like, you know, if I say I feel like tense right now, like that doesn't mean you feel tense right now. But if I say, oh, the air is in the room is a little tense right now, like if you don't kind of say anything, you're sort of just letting that stand as like what the air in the room is like, you know, in some more kind of collective sense. So I think, you know, it's worth practicing language that allows for a lot of space between different people's experiences and so on. And to some extent, you can do this um, kind of even if somebody's phrasing something in a way that feels like it's sort of making an objective claim, and you're like, well, I think that's more of a subjective thing that you're just saying about your own experience. But it is actually also important to be able to be um, sort of shared reality, what is shared reality, and not reify it all as only my experience. It's like, no, we're all having this experience right now. That's how I see it, right? Do you guys all see it like that? Yeah, cool. All right, cool. We're on the same page. And that's like part of where the coherence comes from. This is helpful. This is like I've said a lot of this before, but this last piece is clicking with something else I'd just been recently thinking about. And so it's coming into greater clarity for me, which is like which is about this piece of like basically connecting the frame dialogue thing, which has sort of been a handle that I've been working with for like dialoguing between different frames, and then this fish bowling thing, which I'd also been thinking about for a while. I hadn't quite connected those before, and like the importance of having people be able to use personal subjective language when that's appropriate, but also to be able to use, like, if you know if we were if I were to say right now, as far as I can tell, we're talking in English, like that would sort of be a weird statement, because like I kind of expect you to know that as well. And so like why am I like highlighting the only I know this, like I'm only speaking for myself here. You might think we're speaking like what? Like that should be common knowledge, right? So I should be saying, of course, we're talking in English right now, and thus blah 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 blah. Like I can just state that as a premise that we should both know. And if you're like, wait, actually, no, I think we're, you know, talking in Pig Latin or something, then, you know, you can say eight way, earway akingte in a igpe atenle, and then I'd be like, well, we weren't though, right? Anyway,
Huh.
so yeah.
I remember the other question that I wanted to ask was sort of just, you know, back when I first heard about this, was a very practical question, because I was curious about implementing it myself. And it was sort of about how to do this technically. And you touched on, oh, we share it in Google Drive, and there's sort of different folders that we use for different permissions or groups for different privacy settings. Uh, did you use any other kind of conventions or best practices for like organizing the files or naming them or anything like that?
Yeah. You know, just very in brief, we had a practice of year, month, day naming, which is the correct date structure because it sorts. And but we early on had a convention of 2-year two-digit dates, which is from a long-term archival perspective such a terrible idea. But the reality was, in the short term, those additional 2 characters of content that you could see of like the actual name of the recording on tiny smartphones was just worth it. And it's like it's gonna be a long time before the dates tick over, and by that time, manually renaming all of these recordings to have a 20 in front of them will be easy. So we kind of bit that bullet and went with the 2-digit date names. Then follows the kind of initials of the people in the conversation. So that would sort of, sometimes you could just put single letters. Sometimes you would have to put, like the first couple letters of somebody's name. Like, so if I were, naming this recording between you and I, it might be like, 210906 space Mal Tass podcast episode non-naive trust dance and recordings or something. And but if your name was well, yeah, and then people who would sort of be talked to a lot or like common patterns would get shortened a bit, so you'd have just initials, but that only works when it's unambiguous.
Yeah. So it was sort of dates and then names or initials and then content of the recording, like what the topic or theme was.
Yeah, pretty much. And we sometimes we had a couple of different emoji that we used for things, like stars indicating just like this is a really important recording, or just like a check mark to indicate a check-in. Like,
yeah, fascinating.
We tried having a few more, but those were the main ones that sort of stuck. Like we tried having ones that would differentiate sort of the theory and the practice of the thing. Like, oh, we talked about really cool stuff here versus like we did a bunch of great work like on somebody's own issues or mindset or whatever.
Totally. This is so interesting because the other kind of question I wanted to ask you about before we dived in deeper was just to kind of connect some dots for this particular conversation is, you and I have been friends for a few years, but then a few months ago, you messaged me and were like, hey, I'm trying to get Eric on a podcast. And I met Eric briefly, at Maple and talked to him, but like didn't get to know him very well. But I was like, oh yeah, sure. Like you kind of proposed this idea to me. You said he's going to start a podcast where he's being interviewed by different people, and we'd love it if you started it. And I've had him on twice now. We've had really great conversations and really loved those conversations and connecting with him. And I would just be really curious to hear kind of the backstory there and also what your experience of him is. And this is kind of interesting given the context that we have of like, oh, we're recording a conversation where we're talking about someone else. And I think I asked him about you in the first conversation.
You did. I was just thinking that.
Yeah.
I mean, and
so I kind of want to close the loop here and like get the context.
I appreciate that. There's also this fascinating thing. I think there's something cool about this, which is that like, you could now put a link in the description or even like overlaid on the video of like his video, sort of like, who is this Malcolm guy that they're referring to? Well, here's a conversation between Tasshin and Malcolm. Like, yeah. So Eric and I go back to 2013 when we were both hanging out in the Bay Area with the Center for Applied Rationality community there, which is also kind of very indirectly how I met you through Joshin, I guess. Not that indirectly, but kind of indirectly. And so I have an early memory of talking with him late into the night at a party in early 2013, and I had shared with him, I think, the list of commitments and assumptions that the Waterloo group, which at that time wasn't wasn't actively using either of the names that I've used for it, but we'll just call it Upstart. I was, showing him the commitments and assumptions from that. And um, and he was like, this seems really cool, this is really interesting. And I kind of made a note to sort of like follow up with him later, like, he's, I think, the first person that was added to my Google Plus circles, under or maybe it was just a contacts group, I don't remember. It was some sort of Google thing that I think somehow got linked with circles. But he was, I added him to a list of people interested in this stuff. And and then he and I kind of lived this interesting sort of parallel life for a few years, where every August we would kind of travel to the Bay Area for the CFAR reunion, and many of those years Burning Man, and other, the Effective Altruist Summit, and just kind of other events that were happening around that time. And so for both of us, people thought we lived in the Bay Area, even though we didn't. And we were both Canadians, but we hadn't actually hung out in Canada until 5 years into our relationship. And at that point, he and a couple of other people came to visit the Upstart group in Waterloo, and kind of that was sort of the first serious kind of cross-pollination between the rationalist scene and there, which is something I'd been oriented to for years. I was like, oh, like there's these people who are trying to figure out how to think really well in terms of rationality. These people who are trying to figure out how to think really well in terms of like co-thinking together. Like, what if both? And so that was a kind of early experience of that. And that was when I think I started to get a bit more of a taste of kind of who Eric was in terms of what he was capable of in certain senses. Like, prior to that, he'd just sort of been like a guy I had cool conversations with. But there were a few moments in that experience where he was like able to kind of do some powerful facilitation of complex social scenes and stuff. And yeah, and then kind of what happened. And right, and so I continued having a sense of him as somebody that I could often think with quite well over the coming months, and leading into us going to Burning Man together again with this whole group in 2018, and then in 2019 at the Maple bioemotive retreat, we were there, and something really funny happened in his birthday circle,
which is a circle where people were focusing on him.
Right. It wasn't his birthday, but it was his birthday metaphorically. And so everybody was kind of tuning into what was going on for him, and, trying to get his world, I think, is the sort of circling parlance for it. And, but we'd actually been talking just a day or two before about, like sort of different perspectives, like first person perspective, second person perspective. And apparently you can go all the way up to fifth if you want to get fancy with it. And so Eric was noting that he sometimes has trouble taking his own first person perspective, which I think you two talked about in the podcast episode. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that came out of that retreat as well. And so when we were doing the circle and people were trying to like tune in to what was going on for him, like he kept redirecting the attention back to how they were doing it and other stuff. And there was this subtle sense in which like I just knew him well enough and knew kind of his deal and his sort of approach to life and various other things well enough that I felt like I totally got what he was doing, and the rest of the group could kind of tell that I got what he was doing, but they couldn't figure out it themselves. And so then he and I were kind of playing off each other in this interesting way, which we proceeded to do in a couple of subsequent conversations at Maple. And that was in many, many ways the seed of his podcast. It was this sort of recognition that like Eric, so there are some people who don't talk in a conversation very much. And if you try to say like, hey, I'd like to check in with Stacy, she hasn't said anything in a while, she'll be like, oh, I don't know. I mean, I'm just, I'm good. I'm just listening. It's fine. Like, I don't, like, don't worry about me kind of thing. Right. Like there's people who don't talk very much. And if you direct the attention to them, they do that. And Eric, sometimes in a conversation will be like silent for quite some time, just like sitting there kind of taking everything in, making sense of it or whatever. But if you direct the attention to him, he like always has some sort of observation to make, or like he has his own sense of like where the attention really needs to go, that he's picked up from like just scanning things and stuff. And so, but part of how he's able to do certain moves in conversation or in social scenes is because he's never like asking for or demanding attention. There's an aspect of that. And so the podcast was basically like, how can we scale the thing that happened in the maple scene, where I was throwing the ball to him and saying like, hey Eric, what do you think? Or I think we should do what Eric's best model is of the next move, or something like that. It was kind of like, well, I can just like tell a bunch of people to talk to Eric, and they probably will, and they'll have a good time, and they'll like learn a bunch about themselves, and like people will get more of a chance to meet him and stuff. um and so, yeah, so part of the magic of his podcast has been that I've been taking on pretty much sole responsibility for making sure that he has people on the podcast, and so he gets to just show up and have conversations in the way that he does, without having to evoke ever guy looking for podcast interviewees ever. Like he doesn't ever have to do that without having an existing following, because like I have enough people that I know, and so forth. So that's been really cool. It's been neat to kind of find a way to sort of scale this dimension of this particular synergy between the two of us, because I, on the other hand, attract more attention than I know what to do with usefully. So sort of realizing like, wait, I can like offload some of that to him and he can use it really well, was this pretty cool recognition of a win-win there.
I love hearing that backstory, just because he's a really interesting person, and really enjoyed the conversations that I've had with him. And also I've listened to the other ones that he's done with other folks, and they're always really good. And I look forward to seeing it kind of continue, and seeing where he takes it, and seeing more people kind of get a sense of the unique qualities that he has, and the kinds of conversations that are possible there.
Totally.
Yeah. So I'd love to ask you the question that I usually start with, which is just to hear about your personal story and background, hear more about you, anything that you feel like you'd like to share. We've kind of gotten a sense of some of the vignettes of your life so far, but anything that you'd like to do to give us a sense of the big picture at whatever length that you'd like.
Yeah. I'm kind of just feeling into like how to go about answering this question. And one thing that comes to mind is like, often when I'm speaking something, I find myself needing to kind of back up and give a bunch of context in order to say the thing I want to say. And sometimes it's like a lot of context, to the point where people get lost. They're like, wait, why are you telling me all this? I'm like, well, it's important for understanding the thing I want to say, which is relevant to the thing you were just saying. But like, first you need 5 minutes of backstory. But I guess so. One thing I'm asking is like, oh, like what in the way of particular backstory like might usefully get itself out of the way in relation to anything else I might want to say later on this podcast. But I don't think that I can actually query it like that. Like when I sense into it, I'm like, I really don't know. I feel like I've definitely told some pieces of it through talking about the history with Eric and I. On a totally different note, if I just ask myself, like, what about my history does Tasshin in fact not know and might find interesting? There's something rich there, which is, I was just thinking about this a day or two ago, which is, well, so I just got back from this meditation retreat, kind of virtual meditation retreat that Mark Lippman was hosting, which is very cool. Kind of he's got this global wayfinding meditation style, and he talks about this principle of redo to undo, which is sort of like you sometimes need to revisit past experiences of whatever kind in order to like understand why they're arranged the way they are in your mental landscape, and like um reshuffle that. And so I was thinking, like, what were some of my earliest experiences with meditation itself? And initially, I think the first thing that came to mind was when I was about 15, my mom got into the Eckhart Tolle things. Oprah had a book club. My mom wasn't an Oprah person, but somehow she got made aware of this Oprah book club for Eckhart Tolle. So she was reading Eckhart Tolle, and I picked up Eckhart Tolle, and got, like, lightly now pilled, um, and uh, started meditating a bit, just some sort of basic mindfulness thing. I mean, he doesn't really have instructions in his books that I can recall, like, or if he does, they're really vague. They're just like, notice that you're here now and you have a breath or something like that. And so I kind of gotten into that at the time. But then I realized, actually, no, my history with meditation goes back further, which is that when I was about 11, I used to be at, like, what wouldn't even have been a high school dance by that point, but it was clearly modeled after a high school dance, but it was just like a middle school dance, I guess, or I don't even know. And we would, so we're there at like some community center and somebody's playing Usher or something like that. Um, and I would sit in the middle of the dance floor and meditate. And I'm like, what was I doing? Like, what was that? Um, I think it was partially trying to just be weird.
Hmm.
Like, it's not like I couldn't dance, like, at all. Like, it's not like, so it's just not like I was like, oh, I can't dance, but I can do this other thing. It wasn't that. There was definitely something about, like, having trouble navigating the tensions and complexities of asking people to dance, or trying to, like,
Mm.
go up to pretty girls and, like, be, and, like, also we're like 11 or 12, so it's like it hasn't even quite tipped over into that being the thing to do. But that also is sort of kind of clearly the thing to do. People have their little crushes and their little social status politics, and there I am sitting cross-legged on the dance floor, and I'm like, I was just thinking about that literally, like, this morning or last night or something. I was like, that was really weird.
Mm.
Anyway, so as somebody with the, I don't know, context and history of meditation and so forth that you have, I thought you'd find that an interesting tidbit of my history. um I would say I didn't really start attending to the Dharma as such until more like 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015. Like, there was sort of a very gradual, like, starting to actually look at some of those questions. um yeah. So I don't know, that's a different slice of my history. Yeah, but we'll
How
call
did
it.
you get involved in Upstart or Liminal Space Agency, and like
Mhm.
what were you hoping to accomplish from being there?
Yeah. So when I was in university, I used to go to a lot of seminars put on by a department called Knowledge Integration, which is kind of like a really cool transdisciplinary program, offered only at Waterloo. That and they had these seminars every Friday where they would just bring in a speaker, usually a professor, but from some random department. But I think sometimes they brought in speakers, like, from um, outside of the university. Yeah, they definitely did at some points. And long story short, somebody was doing a presentation on VR and how it was hard to get people to forget that they were in physical space even when they had a VR headset on. My impression is that this has improved somewhat just in terms of the technology since when that presentation was given in 2012. But anyway, uh, and as part of trying to convey this, they did a demo of contact improv with one person being blindfolded. And so there's these two people dancing in kind of, this sort of rolling, swirly improvisational way. And one of them is blindfolded. And they're, and she was highlighting how clearly you are in space. Like you can still feel where you are in space, even when you can't see what's going on. And I was like, I need to do that. I don't know what the hell that is, but I need to do that. And so I went up and talked to them afterwards, and they're like, yeah, we do this every Thursday, down in Kitchener. And I was like, yes, I'm there. And so I went pretty much every week for months to that. And went to some other events, and it turned out that a bunch of the contact improv folks were connected with this culture incubator scene, which at that time was, among other things, known as the household as ecology, like trying to think of the house as kind of an ecosystem, like what are its, what are the ecological niches of different objects in the house, and where do they live, and how do they migrate around the house and stuff, which is still a lens that is used, although not kind of that name. But anyway, so I got introduced to the folks there, and interestingly, on the topic of recordings, I had a journaling practice at the time, and the first night that I was there, I like kind of just crashed in the basement because there was an extra bed and so on, and I recorded this little audio journal to myself, being like, oh my god, I've met the most interesting people, they're so cool. And it was kind of funny listening to it later, because it's on one level actually sort of really shallow, like in the sense that, like, compared to like the level of like depth and importance and stuff that I feel about the things now, at the time I was mostly like, they're having all the coolest conversations, like nothing about like the meaning of any of it. But I think that was what attracted me to them, and in some sense to the rationalist community, was just like people really thinking about stuff. And I guess the other thing I could say was that I've long had a fascination with interfaces, like, and I mean that in a very abstract sense, not just like, computer interfaces, and not just the interface of designed objects in general, like this, handle is an interface with this mug. So of course is the lip of the mug. Don't forget that's a necessary interface for drinking. But interfaces between people as well, and like what kinds of interactions between people yield satisfying, like mutually satisfying upward spiral type dynamics, and what kinds of interactions between people lead to disappointment and despair and frustration and challenges and so forth. Well, challenges, you're always going to get challenges, but difficulty in like the psychological sense, strain, and from the get-go, it was just really clear that these folks had a model of human relating and thus human interfacing that was more sophisticated than anything I had ever seen, and remained more sophisticated than anything else I would come to see over the following 8 years. Like I've there's been important key pieces that we've incorporated from other places, and things that I found like missing, or like necessary elements or various things. But it remains the case that the basic framework being pointed at there is one of the best things I've ever seen in the world for pointing at different human dynamics. And it was outlining kind of, here are the basic things that lead to the upward spiral, and here are the basic things that lead to the downward spiral. And having seen that, as clearly as I had, in terms of like, what was I trying to accomplish there? In the most general sense, it's like, get the upward spiral going more upwardly and spirally, and bigger, and with more people in it, and more consistency, and whatever else. Which is pretty general. And I think the generality is something that I've been revisiting recently, and sort of feeling into, do I want to do I want to have more specific targets, or is that even like possible or wise, given that part of the nature of things is that you don't know what's possible until you make it possible, and like you don't want to like constrain yourself too early, and there's this kind of dynamic tension between um planning and improv or other dimensions like that. um yeah, I think part of what's interesting in terms of like, what was I trying to accomplish there, and I've been reflecting more about this recently, is that in some sense, so as you know, and has sort of implicitly been hinted at by how I've been talking about this group versus what I'm doing now, it's as distinct. I left Waterloo and I left that scene in late 2020, and I was reflecting to Eric recently. We were talking about home, and I said I said like this feels like it could be home, and he asked, was Waterloo home? And I said, uh hmm. And he said, or or maybe he asked like Waterloo could be home or something like that. And I said, no, Waterloo was home. Waterloo never was could be home.
Hmm.
And there was something really, really valuable about getting in touch with how the whole time I'd been living in Waterloo, I'd never intended to live there indefinitely. Like I was there as a university student, who are notoriously transient, right? Although I mean, a substantial fraction of university students end up living indefinitely wherever they do university. Like it's one of the sort of main things that gets people moving and so on. But for the years that I was visiting the Bay Area, I kind of always assumed that sooner or later I would move there. And various factors, including social dynamics and also the fires, um, as well as other things, led me to sort of feel less inclined to try to move to the Bay. But there was something meaningful in recognizing, yeah, I haven't been treating Waterloo like the place I'm intending to live for the rest of my life. Like I'm mostly just friends with the small group doing this culture incubator thing here. Um, and most of my other friends, just measured in terms of like number of people I know who know me and like know each other kind of thing, are in the Bay. Like I wasn't and I wasn't bothering to try to make friends in Waterloo for the most part. So there was a way in which I kind of was recognizing, oh yeah, I was um I feel like I'm answering one of your questions right now, but I've forgotten which one. But
Yeah, you're getting at what you were doing there and what you were trying to
right,
accomplish.
what I was trying to achieve, right? So in some important sense, I have achieved what I was trying to achieve in Waterloo on two fronts. One of which is that insofar as the group there is thriving right now, which I'm not that much in touch with them, but they were recently on the Stoa, and via that and other things, I have a sense of them thriving quite a lot. Um, I I helped create that, and like there were times when it was only three of us, and if I hadn't been there, it would have been only two, and probably wouldn't have had the momentum to get back up to the where it is now, as well as just other things that I contributed to making that culture grow and thrive and so forth. And I feel really good about that. Like I could have in some sense left a few years earlier, but if I had, it wouldn't have had the momentum and stability and so on that it has now. And that's part of, I think, why I didn't leave sooner. But the other reason I didn't leave sooner is I didn't know what I was doing. um, and I still don't know what I'm doing, but I have a framework for making sense of not knowing what I'm doing now. Like I have a kind of meta framework for that. And I knew in 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019 like I had, maybe even going back to 2015, I had some sense of like I want to, like, you know, go start a, rationalist group of people who are doing this, incubating collaborative game B culture or something. I mean, I didn't get the term game B until later, but it's pointing at the same thing. Um, and so I had a sense of wanting to do that, and I knew I wasn't ready. I knew that there was something about the what was needed to actually create such a context that I didn't have, that I couldn't do at that point. And it felt like last summer, with the kind of discovery of the non-naive trust stance, there was a shift to oh yeah, I still in some sense don't know how to do this because nobody does, and nobody even could as one person know how to do it, because it's by its nature involves integrating everybody's different perspectives, and so you can't simply know how to do it. um, but I do feel like I know how to go about bootstrapping a group of people to be able to do it, at least somewhat. And so and so that was the other, the other thing I was really looking for in being there, was developing my own capacity to the point where I could host or create contexts of this kind of learning myself. And I feel like um, I've done that to enough of an extent that I feel like, yeah, the time is ripe to move on and start working on that. And I have, I really have tons of my own blind spots, and it's so vital to have Eric and Sarah as, like part of this whole thing in different ways. Like with, Eric brings his kind of groundedness and his kind of kind of
He does make this facial expression.
yeah, well, that facial expression is a vital piece, and I can't quite do it myself, no. But he has this ability to kind of be aware of a whole system in a certain way, that like I have some of, but he has it on some deeper or more native level or something, in part just because I'm too busy meddling with the system to like see what it's doing a bunch of the time. um and he and I also have the um the stability of having known each other for so long, and having, you know had a lot of satisfying experiences of each other, and not having a lot of, like, built up distrust or challenges between us. And then it's also really valuable to have Sarah involved with this whole thing, because she and I have gone through a lot of strain and a lot of challenge in our relationship. And so it really puts me to the test of, like, doing this non-naive trust dancing thing well, to be metabolizing all of the history between her and I, like, some big misunderstandings early on in our relationship that kind of metastasized and turned into these profound gaps in our mutual awareness or appreciation, that have been very painful and a lot of work to integrate, um, and have been a great um, testing ground, proving ground um, for for the non-naive trust dance process. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I really want to dive in more to that. And I just want to kind of honor the sort of precursors of the non-naive trust dance that you sort of hinted at there, of saying, like, well, you said when I was at Upstart, I learned the things that make the upward spiral go up and the things that make the downward spiral go down.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's a whole thing in itself, but could you share some of those things, like the sort of best practices or good principles that you did learn from Upstart, that you can share at this time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been working on a couple of pieces of writing on those fronts that I'm trying to figure out what to do with. Like some of them would make most sense as like internal documents to like people who were already kind of in that scene, including, you know, dozens of people who have, you know, just come to one workshop that we ever hosted, but they, you know, they have a appreciation for the thing or whatever. But then like I also want to post something to my blog. In some ways the core two pieces are the um these maps of these two different dynamics, you know, which you could call the downward spiral and the upward spiral. Um, and then a list of what were called commitments and assumptions for how to kind of enact those enact the upward spiral dynamic. And where I've come to it now is that, like, I was just a couple days ago rereading some of these pieces and models and stuff, and I still basically resonate with the description of the upward spiral and downward spiral. Basically, the downward spiral is caused by guilt and an undermining of self-trust. And so when people are trying to figure out what it makes sense to do, they second guess their own internal compass and generate behaviors that are trying to do good by some external authority or something, but are undermining some internal sense that they have, which then generates guilt because, or sorry, no, which then generates some sort of behavior that kicks into gear to meet their own needs that they've been ignoring because they're trying to do the right thing according to somebody else, which then generates guilt because they're not doing the thing that they're supposed to do according to the external authority, which then reinforces the idea that they should force themselves to do things that they don't want to do in order to be good. And there's this kind of like yeah, I mean, whipping around back and forth. Like you can sort of see the spiral shape of that, and the reason it goes downward is because it's opposed to itself in a certain fundamental sense. um and there's a kind of striving to only have the good and none of the bad, only have the right and none of the wrong. But the way that it's striving creates the very wrongness that it's trying to avoid by sort of dualistically reifying the rightness of the other thing, and by being unable to kind of listen to um, the other half of things. So that's kind of the downward spiral dynamic. And then the upward spiral dynamic comes from deepening in self-trust and a sense that you can learn by doing and by language is so messy here because on the one hand I want to say learn by doing and by making mistakes, but the whole meaning of what a mistake is kind of even changes here as well. Like in its, you know, there's a kind of like everything's a mistake and also nothing's a mistake, and it's all just learning. And being able to see that and really relax into it generates a different kind of possibility where the things that have, you know, that are in tension in the downward spiral, or kind of rather in oscillation, those things can sort of become used to form some part of a larger whole that is able to more directly be in touch with what it wants because it's not denying what it wants in service of something else. um, and so a lot of this resonates with the kind of stuff that's been becoming more popular in our corner of Twitter the last while around like non-coercion or non-self coercion. um, it applies to other people as well, so it's not just the non-self coercion, but it's also like what does it mean to not coerce others. And coercion is an interesting word. It's one that we've used to talk about the downward spiral in Upstart context. But it's a pretty uncommon word in a lot of social, like in a lot of um, contexts. So I mean, you could maybe map it on to like trying to get a system to perform a different behavior without regard for why it's already performing the behavior it's performing, and like it makes sense for it to be doing what it's doing. Like that's like a way of describing what coercion is. And so self-coercion, somebody who's like, I just need to get up early, I should set my alarm earlier or something, right? There's like an element of like not respecting that, like, no, I don't just need to get up earlier. If I did, I would already be doing it. So there's some other thing going on that's making it so I'm not just doing that. And then similarly with others' behavior as well. And so then there's this list of commitments and assumptions that point at the that actually come out of the experience of the founders of the upstart scene, um, of this period of time when they the culture kind of felt like it really clicked into place, and then they kind of wrote a list of like, what were we doing, what were we assuming, what were we feeling, how were we relating to each other that was generating this. And the list has things on it like everything we know and everything everyone knows is a model of how things are, like sort of, or as Monty Python put it, it's only a model. um Not knowing is a necessary and creative state as part of understanding and action. um there's elements of these assumptions that connect with stuff from the Dharma, right? Like uh being fundamentally happy is worthwhile and attainable. um Everyone wants closeness and autonomy, and these are compatible. Everyone wants to be accepted as they are and also to change, and these are compatible. um No one is right, no one is wrong, no one is to blame for anything was one of the assumptions that people would often take the most issue with when sort of presented with this list. They'd be like, what do you mean no one is right, no one is wrong? Like, um and uh and there's a whole thing, that we could go into now or at some other point about like what's really going on with blame. Like what is blame? I have some, again, kind of half written notes about this, but um it seems to me that there's a sense in which blame is confused, sort of like how geocentrism is confused. It's like geocentrism makes a lot of intuitive sense, man. Like it sure looks like we're in the middle and everything else is going around. um but like you can find a perspective from which you're like, well, that is sort of true, but it's there's a spinning, there's an us spinning thing more than there is a things going aroundness of us, except for the moon. um and so so but yeah, but where I've come to with thinking about these commitments and assumptions and so forth is that they work great as a short-term experimental thing. Like if you're doing a weekend workshop, which is one of the things that they were originally used for, like, you get a bunch of group of people together for a weekend and say, hey, we're going to try out this new culture thing. Here's the basic operating principles. um I sometimes like to use the analogy of like, um there's three simple rules that you can give to some triangles moving around a screen that will cause them to like behave as flocking birds. It's like, don't bump into each other, but otherwise try to get close to each other and face in the same direction. And if you give the triangles those rules, they form very complex flocking dynamics without any top-down control. And so it's, the idea is this is sort of flocking behavior for humans. um and and that works great for a weekend. But the commitments and assumptions don't actually have written into them anywhere what to do if you find yourself unable to reasonably assume something, or what to do if you find yourself feeling conflicted about a particular commitment. And so as far as the longer term learning process goes, i've I've come to recognize like, well, yeah, it's valuable for people to get a taste of these by just trying to go directly to them, like get a feel for what the upward spiral like feels like. But then as if you're trying to actually like, live it in a ongoing, um permanent way, like, which is possible, it is I can say it's possible in the same way that like someone who knew enough thermodynamics could say that flight was possible. Like it's like it's just clearly possible. Um, if you're trying to get there more consistently, it's like, well, you've got to actually really slow down and integrate every voice inside you that says, but no, like somebody is wrong, or but no, I am right, or um, but no, like being close and having autonomy aren't compatible. Like, you know, we have tons of learnings like this. And the bioemotive retreat was for me one of the things that sort of kickstarted my sense of like, wait, I've been trying to like push away all of my voices that disagree with what I, in some sense, do accurately know are the best principles that I could have for navigating my life. Like, in some sense, I know that and it's true. And yet, in another sense, other parts of me don't know it. And arguing with them, you know, trying to just tell them, no, 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 you don't get it. It's like this, doesn't work. It in fact perpetuates the very downward spiral on a smaller scale by saying this way's right, that way's wrong. What are you doing? You're confused. As opposed to, oh, well, part of what's neat is like the place I've come to instead is actually like, I'm so grounded in these principles being right in the way that they're right that I don't need to defend them. And that gives me way more space to listen to my own or others' objections. It's like similarly to like at one point I was hanging out with somebody and we were talking about like square footage of something, and they like multiplied two numbers and they were off by an order of magnitude, and I was like, no, 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 it's approximately 100, not approximately 1,000. And they were like, no. And I'm like, and I like double checked my own math, and I was like, nope, it's definitely the thing I said, but I'll wait. Like, take as long as you need to do the math. I trust that you can do the math and you will come to the same conclusion as me. And you know, if you try for a couple minutes and you're still like no, then I mean I'll check again. But like, but I don't need to argue with you because it's sort of self-evidently true from the right vantage point. And so that's been really cool, like realizing that everything everybody knows is in one sense only a model inside our heads, and is in another sense self-evidently true from some vantage point. And so being like, well, my model's better than your model, it's like, well, maybe, but like, what does your model see that mine might not see? And so this starts to get into some of the non-naive trust stance pieces of like, one of the most core elements of the non-naive trust stance is respecting all distrust that arises. Like, all distrust is knowing something, and it can't be you can't build trust starting from a place of you should already trust. And this was in principle something that was totally part of the ethos of Upstart the whole time, that you know, you can't just say you should trust me. But there were still ways in which we were kind of both internally and interpersonally demanding of people that they trust when they couldn't, on the basis perhaps of them having trusted at some other moment, without recognizing that the compartmentalization involved meant that you're actually dealing with a different sense-making process inside the person, and that sense-making process couldn't trust the same thing that some other sense-making process inside the same person could, because it was working with different knowings.
Huh. Is it fair to describe the non-naive trust stance as kind of like I'm getting a sense of it almost as like an upgraded version of the thing that Upstart was going for, that you started to notice some problems and some patterns and things that, and you were like, here's my best attempt at solving the problems that I was starting to notice.
Yeah, it very much feels that way to me. Because yeah, that's kind of how it emerged. And there is a profound amount of historical contingency to all of this. Like, the name non-naive trust dance has a lot of rich elements to it, and it's not a coincidence that it's named that. But there's also a way in which, like, and I may do things about this over the coming years, um or months even, but like one of the things that's currently a little funny is that, like, in some sense, non-naive trust dance refers to a thing that people are always doing to greater and lesser degrees of skill, and workability and effectiveness. Like, any conversation that people have is them navigating, effectively or not, the trust landscape between them, and building trust, and uh, building distrust, or having gaps in trust. Like, that's always happening, right? And so in some sense, the non-naive trust dance is just a way of talking about a thing that's already happening, but it's already happening. And um, I didn't invent it in that sense of it, right? In the same way that, and that's part of why I talk about discovering the non-naive trust dance, because it feels in some ways more like a discovery than like an invention. um, Having said that, it's a discovery that produces a set of, like, kind of obvious implications for how one might go about trust dancing in ways that would work, in the same way that, and this is an analogy I use often, that, like, learning thermodynamics and aerodynamics, it's like you get an immediate sense of, like, okay, yeah, you can build faster than light aircraft, but they need to have some way of lifting themselves, and there's sort of like three or four ish, I don't know, I mean, some expert in this could talk about it, but, like, there's sort of a few ways to do that lifting thing. And, like, um pushing off against the ground, or can't do it because you can't do that when you're in the air, right? Like, there's sort of these basic principles. And, like, knowing thermodynamics, you would also know that you can't build a perpetual motion machine. Like, there's limits of entropy that prevent that from being possible, but you can build a superconductor, which is kind of cool. um and so there's something where I feel like I've, like, unlocked a very basic couple of fundamental truths about how trust building ever works when it works. Like, it always follows these principles, but the principles themselves are, like, really hard to put into words. They're like this sort of, I mean, in part because they sound almost tautological. Like, they're just like, you can't trust what you don't trust. But, like, if you really take that seriously, and you look for instances where you're trying to get someone to trust you when they don't, without, like, actually changing what's available to them as information, or just, like, salient features that would allow them to trust you instead of not trusting you, like, you notice that this is happening constantly, um with things that people say and do, and so forth. And so even though it's kind of obvious when stated that, like, you can't trust what you don't trust, that's, like, not actually how people operate most of the time. um anyway, I'm getting a little sidetracked from the core thrust of your question, which was, like, um in what sense is the non-naive trust dance an upgrade on the like what Upstart's been doing this whole time? Right, so in one sense, like, it just straightforwardly is, and in some sense even almost too much so, in that, like, um as I was differentiating myself from that, like from just being, like, the main way I have of understanding this collaborative culture thing is um how we've been talking about it here, like, and in particular the way that Gene has been talking about it, Gene being the main founder of Upstart, and that whole project. um as I was differentiating myself from her thinking, there was a way in which, like, any difference that I had between how she was seeing things and how I was seeing things, that felt central as opposed to just aesthetic or something, um, got kind of put in the non-naive trust stance. And in that sense, I'm not sure it's one thing. Like, it's in some ways a placeholder for, like, Malcolm having his own thoughts about stuff, which I hadn't previously felt like I had space to do until I sort of started having this new framework. But in a different sense, it all feels really related. So I hope it's an upgrade. It is at minimum a critique, And I do have concerns that it's possible that I've missed one or two key pieces of the original that Gene still understands that I don't. And that in that sense, it might be a critique that's not actually viable, in the sense that like I might be missing some basic components. And it might be that like I know I see things that Gene doesn't see, because I've seen them, and I've tested them, and they do something. But it may be that I'm still missing some key pieces. And that's part of why, you know, over the coming years, part of what I want to do is uh, find ways to bridge the thinking that I've developed back with Upstart's thinking, which I was already starting to do while I was there, to some success. But I think it's going to be really helpful for us to have had the space that we've already had, and the further space of, you know, me being out here.
I'm getting
In
this
British
metaphor
Columbia,
of
which I'm just going to mention for the recording, because if you're out in British Columbia, particularly on the coast, or Vancouver Island area, I would be interested in talking with you, like nebulous podcast listener people.
yeah, I'm getting this metaphor for how you're describing it, of like it's less like it's an upgrade on the same software and more like an attempt at doing the same thing that's inspired by another thing. Like, you know, like say you were I don't know, to get technical about it, like Mac OS is built on BSDs and it uses components of BSDs, but it's different than BSD. It's like still trying to create an operating system for users. It uses some of the things, but not other things, and it's done differently, but it's in the same design space.
Right. And it's funny that you're using the metaphor too, because we've been using the operating system metaphor going all the way back.
Mm-hmm.
You know, from the very point that I joined, we were talking about the upward spiral as being humanity 3.0, like, you know, which is kind of like the previous two operating systems being the kind of hunter-gatherer pre-game A1, and then the kind of various forms of much more serious hierarchy that humanity's had that are also known as game A. And so the operating system metaphor goes deep, and we've even, you know, been reading some open source texts like The Cathedral and the Bazaar and Homesteading the New Sphere by Eric S. Raymond. And we've been talking about the non-naive trust dance as something of like a fork of the OS, I guess, a fork of the code of the cultural kernel that Gene's been stewarding for years. And so yeah, and I mean, maybe one way to point at that a little bit there is like, you know, is NNTD the whole fork, or is it just the changes that I've made on top of the fork, right? Like, is it just the patch? There is a way in which part of what's going on with the NNTD is very much designed to mediate between cultures and assumptions and protocols kind of wherever they're at. And so I think that similar patches might be able to be created from the same sort of font of inspiration that I've been drawing from for other communities, other groups, other practices, like, you know, various ways in which circling could benefit from a similar patch, or nonviolent communication, or like other similar things. And that would make them all more able to talk with each other, because of this basic assumption of like, if something's not working for us such that you don't trust me, then, well, you can't trust me. Like, that's how it is, and that's the ground from which we need to start, and that needs to somehow be okay, in the sense that, like, otherwise you have to throw out the universe and get a new one.
I'm just reminded of, I had a conversation with my friend Lindsay Harrington on the podcast a few months ago, and she talked about her experiences of doing nonviolent communication, and then she's been doing circling training through Circling Europe, and at Maple doing the circling retreats there. And like, I think that was a pretty jarring shift for her to go from like extensive experience with NVC to doing circling, and like kind of integrating the different paradigms. And you know, she's been making the best of it, and it was really fascinating to hear about her experiences of it. But these really are like different ways of getting at the same kinds of problems that have different sort of tools or technologies or attitudes towards approaching these problems. And yeah, I mean, if you take those two, for example, NVC and circling, there's just a lot of friction there in terms of the things that one takes for granted or assumes, or the way that they approach a situation is really like night and day, dramatically different from at least the circling that I've seen done. There are, there's different styles of circling as well. So maybe
Totally,
there's different styles of NVC as well. But I think a lot of different people are trying to get at some of the things you're talking about, and there are cultural gaps between them that can cause difficulty, even though they're aiming at similar things.
Yeah, and the cultural gaps are, overtly greater between NVC and circling, say, than between, my understanding of from a couple of years ago of how to do collaborative culture, and Gene's understanding from a couple of years ago of how to do collaborative culture, such that we were having, some tension and friction between us. Like, it's more overt, the difference between circling and NVC, but the basic breakdown that occurs is kind of the same.
Mm-hmm.
And like in either case, it's like something about how I'm understanding everything and something about how you're understanding everything is having trouble talking right now. And we're both bringing our best understandings of what effective communication looks like. But because we have different assumptions and different aspects of how we're seeing the world, we're having trouble meeting each other. And so that's like a general description that applies to all scales. And
both within oneself and between groups, you're saying, or just between different cultures or something like that, that there can be the same similarly shaped problems.
Right. So I guess there's actually two scale dimensions. So like scale dimension number one is like within a person versus between two people versus between two groups. Scale dimension number two is like the scale of the apparent difference in model. Are we both trying to circle, and we even have the same lineage of circling, but we have some tiny basic assumption that's like getting in all up in the gears, and that is sort of in our mutual blind spot, because it's a blind spot that circling has, that is that is the source of the problem that we're having. And so we're having trouble debugging it with the system that we have because of its blind spot. That's like, no two people can have the exact same understanding of an interpersonal framework, because it's necessarily going to build on all of your life experiences, and nobody has the same life experiences.
I think this whole context really gives a sense of the kinds of problems that you're looking at, not just from your own historical thing of, being at Upstart and really liking what they're doing, and then also seeing some other things that weren't maybe working for you so much, or problems that you saw with it and wanting to take a new approach. Can you describe, just that's like, I'm at least getting a sense of how this might be generalized beyond your own experience to like a very broad set of problems. And so can you describe how the non-naive trust stance approaches these problems and what the solutions or attitudes that it takes towards resolving them are?
Yeah. One of them, there's sort of, if you have a more specific problem in mind, we could kind of look at it more directly, whether that's like something from your personal life, or like just even like a specific type of like conflict you see happening. That might be juicy to kind of have something slightly more concrete. Otherwise, I'll pick something, or I'll speak in general terms, and no one will know what I'm saying.
Sure, I can play ball with this. One thing that I've noticed in recent months that I think is a really interesting general problem for a lot of reasons is, I'm pretty online. I spend a lot of time on Twitter. I'm also navigating between different communities, and I have a lot of different curiosities and questions and interests. I think that probably comes through if someone watches or listens to my podcast of like, this guy isn't just interested in one thing. and the communities of practice or culture that are engaged in the kinds of questions that I'm interested in looking at, or the curiosities that I have, are like wildly different, and there's even different subcultures and stuff like this. Um, so that, I mean, yeah, that's a general milieu that I find myself in often, is like there's different places that I go to that have like totally different worldviews or practices or like conversation styles or things like that. So that's one thing. But there's a specific thing that I've noticed that's maybe a little bit more granular of, because I'm so online and the people that I'm friends with or connected to are very, um, they're geographically distributed, they're culturally from different backgrounds, they have different interests and goals themselves. And there's also a higher scale, right, than if we lived, say you and I lived in a village however many 100 years ago. It's not just 50, 100, 150, 500 people. It's like thousands and thousands of people. I have certainly more than the Dunbar number of people that I'm connected to and consider friends. Uh, if you start to reach that scale of intimacy online, it seems to me almost inevitable that some of my friends, people that I respect, enjoy, value, will not value or even criticize or actively dislike or hate other people that I also value and consider, like, enjoy, respect. And this happens pretty frequently to me now, that like some of my friends, it's not just that they like dislike each other, they're like actively critical of other people that I really value and respect. Um, and that causes me some emotional psychic tension. If, like, say someone was like, we'll just take a simple example, just to like put someone in the playing field. Say I had another friend that was like, oh, you're having Malcolm on the podcast, like, I don't trust Malcolm at all, I don't like that guy, whatever their complaint would be. I don't have a specific complaint, but like that would cause me some disease. I'm like, no, I like Malcolm, he's so cool, and we had a great conversation, and like it was really fun, and I want to have him on again. Like, what do you mean you don't like him? But I also like this other person. And the simple thing to do socially would be like, sort of like choose a battle of like, okay, I'm going to choose Malcolm, or I'm going to choose this other person. But it's like, no, I really like this other person, they're great too. I had them on the podcast and they were really fun to talk to, and I really like talking to them about this thing and value them for these reasons. And that causes some, because I don't reach for one of the easy things of just like choosing one over the other. It's like causes emotional psychic distress, and often like social interpersonal distress of like, oh, these people really don't like this other person or this group or whatever.
Cool. Yeah. This is something that I haven't done that much, like applying NNTD to so far. So we're very much going to get me live on this,
Love it.
which is cool. I'm curious if you have a sense, based on what you've already heard, of like sort of what would you expect me to say as, like, I don't know, step one or something, of like how I would go about approaching this.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, you said that like you can't force trust. You can't force people to trust if there isn't trust, and that is like really honoring and acknowledging that distrust is the basis for building trust. And so something like, you can't argue with someone about their distrust or force them to trust someone else, but instead maybe to like be curious and investigate, and then probably that there's a there, like, uh, just if there is some distrust, that there's some signal or meaning to that distrust, even if you don't have to like totalize it or say, oh, this person is evil and should never be talked to and should be shunned or something. Like, if there's distrust, then there's probably something significant there that's like worth listening to and asking questions about or something like that.
Yeah, that very much feels like that was the first thing that kind of came to mind for me, and part of why I put the question to you is because I feel like that's sort of the main thing I've said about NNTD
Mm-hmm.
on this podcast so far, is this piece,
Mm-hmm.
which in some ways is the piece,
Mm-hmm.
but I mean there's lots more that could be said. So it's like, yeah. So then there's questions like, well, how do you do that though? right? Like how does one actually go about respecting distrust?
Mm-hmm.
And it definitely can, it depends a bit on how people have been like already talking about whatever they're talking about. Like, if somebody were to phrase it as, as you initially did, of like, oh, I don't trust that Malcolm guy or whatever, then it's like there's something really powerful about the phrasing "I don't trust" that lets you say, like, I respect that you don't trust that, without actually agreeing that the thing they distrust is bad, right? Like that, it's one of those language pieces that is really, um, really firmly subjective. Um, uh, I don't like the word subjective. It has like implications that I don't want. But it's really clearly them speaking for themselves, as opposed to speaking about like what is. Um, it's a lot harder to respond in a similar way if somebody just says, like, oh, Malcolm's a, you know uh, uh, bad person. I don't know. Uh, Trying to think of what the actual thing would be. Like often when things like this come up, it's because people are sort of judging a worldview of somebody else or something. I don't know. Somebody could judge me for being insufficiently woke, probably. If that was a like thing, if there's some important piece. So then it's like, well, if somebody was judging me for being insufficiently woke, but like said it as Malcolm's like right wing or something, then now we've got a whole bunch of models, because I'm not right wing per se. I have in fact found a way to feel superior to both. Um, and um, so then it's like, well, then you'd be dealing with like, maybe, to the extent that that you might be wanting to say to them, well, like, Malcolm's not really right wing, but you don't want to be saying that in a way that feels like it's denying what they are in fact saying, which is that I, don't adhere to some prescribed left-wing set of politics either, leaving aside the fact that left and right have like rotated what the hell they're doing 2 or 3 times in the last century, um, and are pretty arbitrary tags for things. But like, they may have some thing that's true about what they're saying, but they're expressing it in a way that is like contains false implications. True and false are kind of messy, but um, and so it's hard to respond in a way that, you might say something like you might try to like dive into more of like what are the actual nature of their concerns, right? Like, and and then to whatever extent there's common ground between the two of you, like, suppose, or between, in this case, them and your model of me, right? Like they might say, oh, I, blah 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 blah, and you might be like, I'm pretty sure Malcolm's like on board with that too. They'd be like, well, I don't know if I can trust that, because like I haven't seen blah blah blah. And then that's, where you can start to say, well, yeah, that makes sense that you can't trust that, like you don't have the experience of him that I do, like, right? Or you might say, here's a thing of his writing you can read that might give you a taste of how he thinks about this. But ideally still with a tone of, and if that doesn't convince you, that's okay. you know if it doesn't convince you, it doesn't convince you. It shouldn't convince you if it doesn't. Like there's like almost like a, of course, of course not. Um, and that's part of what it means to really shift from orienting to trust as a sort of naive thing that you would sort of ask somebody to do, even if they didn't, whatever, to a non-naive thing that is in some sense unshakable, because it's it doesn't involve blocking your own perception of things or something. um it's And it's worth noting that a lot of what people do that is in some sense non-naive is still profoundly overgeneralized. Like somebody who's had an experience their whole life of being treated well because they grew up in a context where people treated each other fairly well as contexts go is going to have a, you know, a non-naive trust based on their experience that people will treat each other well. um if they overgeneralize that to it is not possible for me to get mugged or robbed no matter how like uh you know dark of, or you know, crime ridden of an area of the city I walk through, or you know, it is not possible for this person who is, you know, sending me an email saying that they, you know, are a Nigerian prince. It's not possible that this could be a scam, right? Like if they overgeneralize it to that, well, yeah, that's going to end up, you know, being naive in a certain sense. But we can only say it's naive because we know that something that they don't, based on our experience of the world. And from somebody's perspective, if they if they've just overgeneralized but haven't actually negated anything that they know, they're still making an actually good bet based on their experience. um I mean, everybody's always kind of making a good bet based on their experience, but usually in a much more compartmentalized way where like the part of them that's making the decision is like doing so in the face of other parts of them that are saying no, no, wait, that's bad. um yeah, I've again run a tangent and forget what the original thing was that you asked. I mean, I guess we're just sort of exploring this piece around this, like, you know, different friends who have different um different models. Yeah, I mean, people do also have different reasons for being upset with other with other people, or distrusting or hating other groups of people. And I think it's worth, yeah, kind of hmm, acknowledging that those reasons are there and that you don't necessarily know what they are or something.
I'm getting the sense that, like in this, I'm trying to make what you're talking about practical and
Hmm.
use this situation. I'm getting the sense that you in this situation would just be like, acknowledge the distrust, maybe ask questions, maybe give them a way out of it, but like you can't force something different. And uh, probably realistically in that situation, you're not gonna, you know, say I had a friend Joe that really disliked you and distrusted you, like probably realistically I'm not going to get Joe to trust you or like you, like if that is possible, it's going to be on the basis of acknowledging and inquiring and being curious about what his distrust
and
is.
and getting him whatever information he would need in order to trust. And when I say information, like I don't mean theory per se. There's I mean information in the information theoretical sense.
Mm.
um like in the sense of like experience primarily. The other thing though that I would note is that there's sort of 2 points of concern here. One is Joe doesn't trust me. The other is, does Joe distrust you because you are connected with
Right,
me?
totally.
And that might be something that you can deal with more directly, where you
Mm.
might, you know, you might say like, um, you might invite, to the extent that you feel capable along various axes of doing this, you might invite the person to share, you know, what impact does it have on you and on our friendship that I'm close with this other person? And you might find that they have some concern about you that actually can be assuaged by something you might say, or um, something you might do that would cause them to feel relief around some concern that they had, that was actually about you, not like not directly about me, but was coming up in relation to me, because that caused them to question some ease that they might otherwise feel around you.
Mm.
Because
Like they'd be worried, they this person distrusts you and they're worried that you're going to take advantage of me, and so it's not so much that they care about you as such, but they care about
they
me in
want to be able to
relationship to
trust
you.
that you're not going to get taken advantage of in
Right,
some particular way, right?
right.
And so that could involve coming to trust that I wouldn't try to do that, but it could also involve coming to trust that you are wise to such things in whatever the space of things is that they're concerned about, such that you wouldn't get taken advantage of.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, in these situations, it's like I'm a different person than they are, and probably like they might have drawn a boundary with someone or the way they relate to someone that like I don't need or have the need for in the same way. And it like makes sense that they would have that boundary or that need, and
Yep.
also that I wouldn't need that boundary or want that boundary or something like that. And just like different people are going to operate differently. Uh, what's a like I tossed out this example, which is like an active theme that I experience. But what's the like? It's kind of a complex and complicated, like high stakes, very nuanced kind of shaped
They all
thing.
are.
They all are. Okay. All right.
I mean, in some sense,
Uh-huh.
like in part because like if you're building a framework whose role is to kind of mediate when all your other attempts fail in a
Mm-hmm.
certain sense, right? Like at some point I'm probably going to write up dimensions of trust dancing that are or like aspects of the whole trust dancing thing that are like less about the specific like how to deal with like problems that occur, like breakdowns in dialogue because of having different frames or assumptions or something. Probably at some point I'll write up something that's more like, uh how to go about having good first dates, right?
Mm.
Which is like you're not dealing with a bunch of existing distrust locally. You're in fact dealing with a kind of over optimism of how well things are
Mm.
going to go usually. And but like anyway, so like um but having said that, a lot of my attention has been on where other things break down, because the reality is there's lots of other great advice that works great when it works. And so the
Mm-hmm.
actual thing you need to deal with is what do you do when the best approach that you have is failing?
Mm. Mm.
Um,
Well,
something like that.
yeah, that all makes sense. I wonder if we could use an example that's like a little bit more relatable for people, maybe of like I imagine that, a number of people watching or listening to this, like, will be in a close friendship or a close romantic relationship or something like that, that has friction of some kind, some disagreement. Uh, what is the stance or approach that you would take from the non-naive trans stance to like, oh, I don't know, let's say two people are arguing about over who does the dishes or something like that. That's a classic example.
That is such a classic. That's
Yeah.
such a classic.
So what do?
What do? Well, one principle that I just jotted down a few minutes ago that I was wanting to bring in anyway, and I think it does apply to the dishes type thing,
Mm-hmm.
is if it feels like somebody is questioning something that should go without saying, say it.
Hmm.
um, it's very common for people to get
Like
in
dishes need to be clean or something like that to eat off of.
or I would like for the dishes to be clean. Like if it feels like if somebody will be like, and you blah blah blah, and you have this subtle sense like it sounds like they think I don't want the dishes done. What kind of idiot would think that I don't want the dishes done too? What a fucking buffoon. How could they not possibly know that I also want the dishes done? Jesus fucking Christ. And turns out, in my experience, about 3/4 of the time, if you just utter the sentence, I would also like the dishes done, that matters to me too, the person goes, oh shit, I hadn't noticed. Like you're standing there being like, this should be so obvious. I can't believe they don't know. It's like, have you tried telling them? Like, have you actually tried? Um, I think that part of what's going on here is people get caught up in how misunderstood that they feel, that they don't have space to feel like it's and sometimes it's because you don't want to, like, you think you're having a thought that's like, this other person must be an idiot or must not know me at all after however many years we've been together, if they think this about me. And those are like some pretty judgmental thoughts to have. And if you don't feel like you can say the obvious thing without like being like, obvious thing, you idiot, then like, well, that kind of makes sense. But sometimes you can just say, okay, look, I'm about to say a thing, I heard on a podcast that sometimes it's good to say obvious things, right? And so I'm gonna say a thing. This may be super obvious, but I'm gonna say it anyway because maybe it'll help. And then you say, I also like clean dishes, right? Um, or whatever the thing is. Or often this could be about like states of affairs, states of things. Like I want the dishes to be clean, or it could be things like I don't want you to feel burdened with having to do more of the dishes than you want to do,
Mm.
right? That's again the sort of thing that like kind of ought to be obvious in a friendship, and yet we read a lot into each other's behaviors. And so if you're behaving in some way that your roommate sees that feels connected with some other person who really, really seemed like they didn't, like they wanted to dump all the dishes on other people or whatever, right? Or some parental thing or something, whatever else, then it can be really valuable to just explicitly state, like, it seems that what I'm doing is causing some sort of problem for you. I would like you to not have that problem.
Mm. Mm. I'm really glad you said that, because the sentence, like, I don't want you to be burdened with the feeling of doing more dishes than you want to, was like really powerful for me to hear that. And I was like, what is happening in that sentence? What exactly, like, because I mean, it's specific to the dishes problem, which is a common but also not the only problem that this framework would solve.
Mhm.
But then you stated kind of the general thing of like, it seems like you're having a problem, I don't want you to have that problem. Like, yeah, almost from a like meta loving kindness perspective, my heart is just
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
melting hearing that. It's like, wow,
Mhm.
that is so sweet and so true. Like, I think people, I believe that about people, that like people don't want other people to have problems or be causing the problems, but these frictions are just so sticky and persistent and like confusing and disorienting on really deep levels. Yeah.
Yeah. And like sometimes there's sometimes we do want each other to be having problems.
Mm.
Sometimes like, uh uh, like uh like a lot of laws are based around causing problems for people who do things that the lawmakers deem are bad,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they're like, yeah, I want you to be having these problems. I like, the uh the installation of like tiny like blocks on like ledges to prevent skateboarders from skateboarding, grinding on the ledges, is definitely trying to create problems for the skateboarders,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're like, these are our ledges, they're not for skateboarding, go to your skate park, right? On a deeper level, they don't want the skateboarders to feel thwarted particularly. They just want that to not be a good place to skateboard.
Mm-hmm.
They want
Mm-hmm.
they want the skateboarders to have a skate park, probably. But there is a local sense in which they are actively trying to thwart somebody else's thing. But yeah, I do think most of the time that's not what's going on. And even when it is, there's usually a deeper level on which the person would say something like, well, I am kind of creating this problem for you because I think you need to have this problem, but I think you need to have this problem because I feel like if you don't, then you'll be creating some problem for me,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like
Mm-hmm.
a lot of it amounts to that.
Right. Right.
Um,
I'm getting the sense with this that, like, well, there's two things. One is, just having this conversation with you, I'm really aware of how much depth and care there is to this framework of like the ways that you're modeling things and seeing the problem of the kind of general problem. Like, if you want to have a framework for building trust and solving trust issues at different scales internally between two people at large in society, like, that's going to be a complex, complicated, hairy, nuanced framework, right, to really address those things. And also, I think you're still in kind of the early stages of explaining this thing and sharing it and distributing it. um, I'm wondering, just to make it sort of even more relatable for someone that's listening to this, if they've been kind of intrigued by this and what you're sharing, what's like, I have the sense with this sort of thing that you often it helps to like be attuned to these kinds of dynamics or themes in one's own life, and that positions you well to like receiving the instructions or model or framework if you're like already attuned to
Mm-hmm.
the like phenomena that the thing is trying to solve. And I'm wondering if there's sort of like a take home experiment or like homework
Oh, yeah.
assignment or like challenge or curiosity or investigation that someone could try at home from this conversation of like, what is happening here, or what, or even a thing of
Yeah,
an
yeah.
intervention of what to do if there is a problem.
Yeah, great question. I have one thought that I just kind of want to append onto the previous
Mm-hmm.
thing that we were saying about the dishes, um, which is, suppose that you say something that feels obvious to you, right? There's sort of uh, a couple things that can happen at that point. I mean, one possibility is that the person goes like, "No, duh, dipshit, I know that," but like, I've yet to see that happen in a couple dozen of saying obvious things, especially if you preface it with "This might sound obvious, um, but I mean, if that happens, I don't know, you've got a whole other thing. But the two main things that happen are, um, one, the person has like an immediate like softening and kind of like, oh, I hadn't really taken that in, or I didn't know that about you, or I feel like they have some sort of softening receiving type of energy. um Another possibility is that there's the slightest bit of kind of hesitation or guardedness, and in that case, I would that seems like an instance where basically the person is, where it's not as simple. The person can't integrate the thing you've just said as simply as, oh, I didn't know that, because it seems to somehow not just be unlikely given what they've experienced so far, but actually contradict what they've experienced so far on some level. Like, so they have a bit of like, but if that's true, then how? And it's possible to have I could believe that, although I don't know how that would then fit with this other thing. Like, sometimes people can kind of hold both. But if somebody is having trouble taking in what you're saying because something else seems to contradict it, then that's, again, a classic instance of a situation where the thing to do is respect that they can't trust you, basically. And the way that I would approach that is, if they seem a bit guarded around my saying, I don't want you to be having, this problem that you seem to be having based on what I'm doing. Like, I don't want to be creating that problem for you. If they seem guarded in response to that, I might say something like, um, and if if you're having trouble believing what I'm saying, like, that's okay. Like, I'm not going to ask you to take my words at face value if they don't seem trustable to you, or something like that.
See, I think for me in that situation, assuming I had said the thing, which that's a phrase I'll be kind of mentally noting,
Mhm.
is not one that I've had before. So this is a counterfactual situation. But I think I would get really curious about like what the reservation or hesitation was of like what was uh, not jiving for them about me
Yeah,
saying that.
totally. What I want to suggest is, before you get curious about it,
Mm-hmm,
say again the obvious thing,
mm-hmm,
hopefully obvious, that you respect that it exists.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Because
mm-hmm.
otherwise, the getting curious can come off as a kind of interrogation that's
Or
trying to
like
like, what don't you
manipulation
trust
to
about
try
what
to
I just
fix it.
said, kind of thing, as opposed to like, okay, you don't trust what I just said. I respect that. That's totally okay. And the language that you use for this is not important.
Mm-hmm,
The
mm-hmm,
important piece is the meaning.
mm-hmm,
Like, conveying to them as best you possibly can, given the entire history of the context of everything between you, that in fact it's okay that they don't trust this particular thing.
mm-hmm.
Um,
What
and
are
if they don't buy that, that's also okay.
mm-hmm,
And that's a part where that's the point where I would start to kind of look inwards a little bit. Like, if I try to say to somebody, and like, if you don't kind of buy that I don't want you to be having this problem, that's okay. And if it seems like they don't buy that, I might say, like, hey, it seems like in general my words aren't really uh feeling very trustable to you right now, and like I'm going to go inwards and just take a moment and sense into if there's something I'm hiding that you might be picking up on, like, and I would just kind of run a diagnostic check of like, is there some resent that I am carrying and not acknowledging or something like that.
Hmm.
It's not necessarily about me, but like insofar as somebody's not trusting what I'm saying kind of multiple times, it's like there's definitely some chance that I'm not as integrated in that moment as I sort of think I am.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm just really aware in this moment of like something like you having a lot of models at play for who humans are and how they operate and how they interact that like are really subtle, that like um might be hard to make explicit, of like how we perceive and how we behave and interact with each other. And
Well, I'm gonna try.
yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, and sort of with that, coming back to this question of like a experiment that someone could run at home or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
to be attuned to these things, like what yeah, like what are even these dimensions that about how one's mind works and interacts with other minds and other people,
Yeah.
and what's something you can try to be attuned to those things or interact with them differently.
So a really simple experiment that's totally different than everything we've been talking about so far
Mm-hmm.
is go to YouTube
Mm.
and pull up some video that there's sort of two ways to do this. One is like pull up a video of somebody you don't particularly like, or some like news channel that you don't watch, or something like that. But another version of this is like pull up a video of a guy that of some person that you genuinely think might have good things to say about relationships or something like that. Relationships are sort of a good topic for this, or just like psychology, motivation, things that you have a lot of your own embodied experience of how things work, right? You're like, what works for you and what doesn't, even if you don't know that you know it. That's actually probably better than the newscaster one, but you can do this with anything. So, and then you watch the video and try to pay attention in your own mind for phrases like "I don't buy it" or "that's bullshit" or
Mm-hmm.
"no, that doesn't work because," and then probably some model or some memory or some
Mm-hmm.
experience you have that suggests that the advice they're giving won't work. Um, and or pay attention in your body to just like moments of tension, or like you might even notice yourself shaking your head no a little bit, and then just pause the video and just take a moment to respect your own distrust,
Mm-hmm.
um, and to and having respected your own distrust enough, which might just be a little bit, or you might need to hold 10 minutes of just like really like, wow, yeah, I really don't trust this. Having done that a little bit, return your attention to the video. Don't even hit play again yet, unless you've completely forgotten what he was saying. But return your attention to the video, and then go, yeah, okay, this person, even though I've got some distrust about the safety or relevance or validity of this advice, this person genuinely thinks this is a thing worth saying.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're in a situation where the person, this is why I was saying maybe don't do the newscaster thing, because that's a whole different like bullshit factory. But like if you're in a situation where you're watching someone who you genuinely think has things worth saying, right? Like and then it's like, can you hold simultaneously, there's something that's off about this for me, but also they are saying it and they think there's something important and worthwhile about what they're saying, like, and can you sort of respect that those are both true at once? that could be just like really basic practice in, I mean, self-trust for one. Like, um, the as I said, you know, building self-trust is one of the kind of core pieces of the upward spiral thing. Um, but we didn't actually talk that much about how to do it.
Mm.
And I would say that this is one, is like, you know, listen to or watch or whatever people saying stuff, and just notice all the moments when your inner voice, for whatever reason, says, I don't buy it. Just be like, great, I don't have to buy it. And just really, really honoring that. And then you might have some other part that like of yourself that gets upset at the part of you that's like, I don't buy it. That's like, look, if you don't buy this, then we're never going to be able to solve our motivation problems. You're like, so I don't buy that we don't buy it. It's like, great, welcome, hello, yes, like, yeah. And this like this connects on a sort of deep level with the say the obvious thing, which is that like part of why we need to say the obvious thing sometimes, well, there's a few reasons. I mean, one of them is just like what's obvious from my perspective is not obvious from your perspective, but also things that in a sane society would be obviously common knowledge are not common knowledge in our society. The history of how we were, broadly speaking, raised, you know, everything from parenting to schooling and so forth, has done a lot to undermine the validity of our own experience as a basis for knowing. You know, a little kid knows that it's time for them to go to the bathroom, and the teacher is like, no, not now, Jimmy.
Mm. Mm.
Or knows that something about what they're being taught or how they're being taught it isn't working. And it's like, no, this is education.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
Yeah.
you know, people get essentially gaslit about what learning even is. Like, and this is related to what you're saying about models of human beings. You know, if you model human beings as being incredibly learny creatures, then and that become less so by adulthood.
Mm.
I mean, part of that is neuroplasticity, very small part of that in the grand scheme of things. But 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 it's like, what happens to people such that they get less learning when they go through education?
Mm. Mm.
Anyway, I have lots of rants on that available too.
Yeah.
So that's an exercise, and that's a fun exercise because kind of anybody can do it. You're potentially already on YouTube right now. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, you could even like consider, you could like think back over your experience of listening to this podcast, and you could be like, is there anything Malcolm said that seemed kind of like bullshit, or like kind of, you know, like I didn't buy it, or I thought he was naive or confused or something. And like any voice that you have in yourself like that is like exactly what you need to be listening to. And you know, when I said like I don't have on my own, like I couldn't possibly make this whole thing happen, in part because it's not a one person sized thing. That's partially because, yeah, lots of what I'm saying is bullshit. Like, it's from other people's perspectives. None of it's bullshit from my perspective, or I wouldn't be saying it. But like, it indeed is naive to lots of realities of what being human and being in relationship is like. And so I need to be able to listen, which I used to think was about like, I don't know, like humility and like trying to like, I don't know. I'm actually like, I'm like rethinking this as I'm saying it. I'm like, there's a sense in which it's about humility, but humility is not about humility. Like, listening is a skill, and it's mostly the skill of not losing touch with what you know.
Mm.
Like, to the extent that you can be in, like, to the extent that you can know what you know yourself and not lose touch with that, and to the extent that you can trust that you will not lose touch with that, in general, I think it's pretty easy for people to listen. And so if somebody's asking you to listen harder, it's like, start by listening to yourself harder.
Hmm. Hmm. Interesting.
Is sort of what I would say. And this is very related to this thing I was just saying around self-trust. Like, there's sort of the same thing.
Hmm. Well, there's so much here that I could keep asking you about, and I would love to keep talking to you about it. And maybe
4-part
we'll,
episode.
yeah, multi-part episode. Let's let's do it. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how you continue to explain these things that you've sort of internalized and how you share them with the world. So
Hmm.
hopefully this podcast can be a venue for you to continue to do that.
Yeah, that sounds good. I think that'll be fun. And um yeah, I valued uh your listening and your helping zoom in on some of these kind of more concrete situations. Like you brought this one from your life, and we also talked about the dishes, which as you said are a classic. And um yeah, so and I mean, it'll be cool also if if we have another episode in a few months or something like that, like hearing more from you about, like, oh, I tried the obvious thing, and like obviousness thing, and like here's what happened, and like that'll be fun.
Totally,
So,
totally. And the respecting distrust of self or other.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time, Malcolm, and really looking forward to having more conversations about this.
Yeah, me too.